Welcome to Design Emergency, where Alice Rosnorn and I, Paola Antonelli, discuss the world as it is now, as it could and should be, using design as a lens, a strategy, and a powerful tool towards positive change. During this podcast, we offer you prodigious designers and their irresistible ideas, at times blessedly practical and solution-oriented, and at times exquisitely speculative. And now, by designers, we mean all creatures, including architects, engineers, artists of all plumage, and other assorted animals that set out to state and achieve goals in the service of others, using the means at their disposal with elegance, economy, and respect for others, for other humans, other beings, and other ecosystems. And with this introduction, today's creature is Liam Young. Welcome, Liam.
Thanks, Paola. Great to meet in this space.
So Liam Young is a pioneering architect, filmmaker, researcher, and world builder whose work sits at the intersection of architecture, science, climate fiction, and technology. So whether you're a seasoned architect, a design enthusiast, or someone curious about the future of our cities and our world, you're in for a treat. So sit back, relax, and get ready. So Liam, here we go. So you come from Australia, and what did you study?
So I originally studied architecture in Australia at a rather extraordinary conservative school where we really learn about the fundamentals of architecture, timber-framed housing and the poetics of space. And the dominant narrative in that context is genius loci, or the spirit of place, like how one designs for site and for context. But I very quickly figured out a way to escape. And it's been a long time since I've been working back in Australia.
You've been running ever since, not from Australia, but rather from the orthodox and traditional kind of architecture. So when I met you was several years ago, and you were in London, where you had co-founded a company called Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, which was an urban futures think tank. So what was a studio and a think tank about urban futures?
I was on a journey, really. I left Australia after studying architecture. I landed in London and I did my time in the star architect system. I worked for Zaha, and I soon realized that what we often think about or talk about as the avant-garde of the architecture profession is really, in many ways, a service industry to the mega rich, building trophies and trinkets for despots and dictators. And if one really wanted to affect change, in many ways, the bleeding edge of traditional architecture practice perhaps was not the space in which to do it. So I was looking around and I saw that the forces changing and shaping cities in many cases no longer existed within the domain of traditional architecture. Large-scale public spaces, squares, fixed permanent infrastructure, the sorts of things that architecture traditionally had remit over, that traditionally defined our spatial and urban experiences, were increasingly marginalized and in turn replaced by mobile technologies, access to the network, and systems of AI governance. And that if one truly wanted to engage with the forces that were shaping contemporary cities, one needed to work with technologies that arrive at us so fast that the slowness of architectural practice has no chance of keeping up. So we moved into fields of speculation, exploring the idea of how emerging technologies were changing our urban, architectural, our planetary futures. And we started to use mediums of film, of storytelling, of world building as a means to get ahead of what I describe as these before culture technologies that arrive faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they might mean arrive at. So we started to create this futures think tank as a way of engaging with the technologies that were shaping and changing our lives.
And technology is really central, both as a foil and sometimes even as a companion to everything that you do to your imagination. So, how do you feel about technology, and what is your new technology go-to like attitude when something new comes to you? How do you usually take it? With open arms or with like a modicum of skepticism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm described in various forms as a dystopian or a radical optimist, depending on the
Hmm.
context. Uh, I would say that the best description of my work to date is really that of a pragmatist. Um, I'm not in denial about the role that technology plays in our lives. Technology has always been a driver in natural change, but I'm interested in the ways that we can operationalize and co-opt technology to somehow dig us out of the various holes that we've created for ourselves. But in many ways, I think that my role in the context of these technologies we might be talking about, whether it's drones or driverless cars or AI or geoengineering systems and so on, is really that of providing counter narratives. Like I really think that's kind of a role of an artist or a storyteller in the world today is putting into place stories that somehow run against the grain of the dominant media narrative. So a lot of our early work did sit in many ways in the dystopian because the dominant narratives around technology pre-pandemic were extraordinarily optimistic, primarily because those technologies were being sold to us. This thing was going to connect us better to our families. It was going to make our lives better, give us better orgasms, make us happier, whatever it may be. Because technologies, they're able to be monetized at the moment that they can be sold to us, not at the moment that they necessarily are going to create the change that we want in the world. So I would talk about the fact that and make work about the idea that these systems that were structuring smart cities relied on massive data capture and ubiquitous surveillance. I would talk about the ways that driverless cars need to see the world and the way that meant that world needed to be mapped and ourselves needed to be mapped with millimeter precision. I would talk about the bias that would be embedded in these systems. So trying to complicate the narrative around these technologies to talk about their unintended consequences, to talk about drones as cultural objects, not as objects of war, to try and shift the narrative a little bit.
Thinking of counter narratives as pragmatic gestures is really beautiful. And counter narratives are now more important than ever. So I really appreciate what you're saying. Now, world building is a practice that might be relatively familiar to those that are not really steeped in the design discourse. So, can you describe what a world builder does and where the practice comes from?
I think that world building is a design practice that is the most relevant for our age, an age where nothing exists on a single site anymore. It's impossible to talk about the act of an architect or a product designer as designing something for a single point on the map. An architect isn't just filling a blank spot on a vacant piece of land. A product designer isn't just designing something that slides into our pocket, but rather architectural, interior, and product design scales have collapsed together with planetary scales. And everything we do resonates across the ends of the earth. The choices we make at the scale of an iPhone have consequence at the scale of landscape, the scale of massive extractive territories on the ends of the earth all over the world. So world building is a practice that understands that objects, buildings, ourselves exist within a complex planetary ecosystem. And that to really design any of these objects at any of these scales, one needs to be designing and thinking at the scale of the planet, constructing an entire world that includes productive and extractive landscapes, that includes sites of consumption, that includes energy landscapes, but also that includes the cultural animation that is set into motion when we design something for the world. So world building is this broad and inclusive practice that situates a design object within this web of planetary flows of culture and technology and resources.
And indeed, before building worlds, you need to know worlds. So, another really interesting aspect of your career when I met you is that you were also running Unknown Fields, which was a nomadic research studio that you had founded with Kate Davies. And you were traveling to the most extreme locations on Earth, to places that my colleagues at CCCB in Barcelona called distant landscapes, the iconic and the ignored, the excavated, irradiated, and the pristine, which is a beautiful definition. And you were going there to explore the underbellies of all of our ecosystem and the invisible networks within. So I was very fascinated by it because I'm so not adventurous that way. And I saw you wearing strange like outfits in Antarctica on another planet, who knows? But why were you going to these places and where were you going and what did you get out of these explorations?
Yeah, we were interested in exploring the scenes behind the contemporary city, the landscapes that don't typically exist in dominant media narratives. And it was born from the idea that in the context of world building and understanding that a city like London is not just this singular object or entity that exists in the United Kingdom, but rather is this entity that is coalescing out of a system of planetary flows and distant landscapes. And we would travel to these places that most often sit outside of the dominant narrative within design and art, and explore them and report back to a world that is doing their best to ignore them, to look at the systems and the landscapes that both are produced by a city like London, but that also produce a city like London. So we talked about this idea that in order to truly imagine the future of a place, you must visit all of its contingent landscapes and all of the places that go into making it and forming it and shaping it. In many ways, we were interested in this now overused quote in the context of futures by William Gibson, the science fiction author, the author that coined the term cyberspace in his novel Neuromancer. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And again, the pragmatist in us took that rather literally. If that were to be true, then it must be possible to get on a plane or a boat or go on a road trip to inhabit these little pockets of the future that exist in the present tense, to inhabit them like a documentary crew, to treat them like stage sets of a future, and to record them and to report back. And then in my own practice, as a world builder, as a futurist, someone who authors maybe science fiction or speculative narratives, the process is then one of exaggeration or extrapolation, where we just look at these sites that we've discovered and just turn up the volume and imagine what their future consequence might be on the rest of the world.
And indeed, at some point, you did take a plane, and all of a sudden, you were in Los Angeles. And I was very jealous, because I've always loved the city, and you were teaching at SciArc, great architectural school, and you've been there ever since. How did the city of Los Angeles change the way you build worlds and change your outlook on the whole practice of storytelling?
My move to Los Angeles was one that was in response to the fact that our work became increasingly filmic. And purely because the stories we wanted to tell didn't take place on a single site. They didn't take place on single timescales. And the traditions of architectural drawing, the plan and the section, the diagram, were wholly insufficient in talking about these planetary scale futures and flows that we were interested in. So we started making films and working in animation and using these mediums as a way to connect to audiences that wouldn't turn up at a Liam Young lecture or exhibition. And inevitably that took me to Los Angeles to kind of co-opt the engine of the Hollywood machine to tell different kinds of narratives. Because the power of the medium that this city produces is undeniable. We on a Friday night, we go to a movie theater, we laugh, we cry, we connect to one another and to stories that are told to us on these flickering screens. And there's immensely powerful possibilities in the ways that these stories connect to us. Power that doesn't exist, I don't think, in the echo chamber of the art world or the pages of a beautifully designed book in a niche architecture bookstore. So I wanted to be a part of that system, really, to connect to that scale of audiences. And that has me here in Los Angeles, trying to exist like a Trojan horse inside this mega machine to understand that these mediums of entertainment don't just need to be mobilized to sell tickets or to create a backdrop for that superhero moment, but instead can be used to be encoded, like, as a vessel for really important narratives about who we are and who we want to be. So
yeah, you are our Trojan horse. Yes.
and what it means, perhaps, in terms of how Los Angeles has changed what we do, that the narratives that we're trying to put into the world, I hope, are more accessible. In many circles, in architecture, design, art disciplines, that word accessible is often leveled as a term of derision, like, oh, that guy's so accessible or populist. But if we truly value the ideas that we talk about, then it seems negligent that we're willing to let them disappear into the void in the latest Triennale, Biennale, or whatever it may be. But if we truly are responsible to those ideas, we need to find and explore the forms that allow them to find a place in the world with as much traction as possible, in front of as many eyeballs as possible.
Yeah, accessibility doesn't mean stepping down to the lowest common denominator. It means finding mediums that are distributed in a different way and that are immediately, once again, accessible to people. So I agree with you. But let's give our audience a sense of one of the works that you have done that has, maybe it's not a collaboration with Hollywood, we'll get to that later, but it's a piece that is a VR platform, that is a movie, that is a book, and that is also, I have to say, part of the Museum of Modern Art's collection, which is Planet City. So Planet City is from 2021, but it took a few years. And it's a fictional city for the whole population of the world, all 10 billion of us, 10 billion in a few years, that allows us to surrender the rest of the planet to what you called a global scaled wilderness and the return of stolen lands. Tell us about Planet City, how it was born, how you made it happen, and how it migrated into so many different platforms, please.
Planet City is, in many ways, our pandemic project. We started it at the beginning of the pandemic, and in many ways it is a Hollywood project because everyone that was working on it, their day jobs is in the service of the Hollywood industry, doing giant superhero narratives and science fiction tales. But of course, in the pandemic, no one was working. So we were able to develop this project that exists in the art world for very different kind of budgets than what these people were used to working with. And we were able to co-opt that Hollywood machine to produce a different kind of narrative. In this case, the narrative of Planet City, which is, as you mentioned, a single city for the entire population of the Earth. And it began as a thought experiment, really. I was interested in E.O. Wilson, the seminal biologist, and his idea of half-Earth. It came to me through Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the collaborators in the book, the seminal science fiction and climate fiction author in America today. And he was interested in the radical idea of half-Earth, which is this plan to stave off mass extinction by devoting half the surface of the Earth completely to nature and restricting human development to the other half that would remain. But as a biologist, many people explore that idea in the context of how you might scaffold the recovery of natural ecosystems in that 50% that we leave behind. The architect in me was much more interested in the radical consolidation of our existing networks and cities that would be required to shrink into that remaining 50% of Earth. I'm a firm believer in a lot of our unknown fields work is really mapping the planetary scaled city that we currently all occupy. We have urbanized the entirety of the Earth from the scale of the cell to the tectonic plate. So to retreat into even 50% of the planet represents the largest mobilization of resources in our human history. So we started with that as an idea, as a research project. And as we got going and we started to do the calculations, we realized that if we took the density of a city like Manila, the current densest city that exists, then less than 50%, you could actually shrink the entire population of the Earth into a city about the size of Texas, 0.02% Earth even. And that most extreme pragmatic approach to what a city could be in this degrowth version of our Earth was what Planet City became. And we set a few rules for this world. One, that no new resources would be extracted to build this city. We wouldn't invent a new technology that would power or run this city. There's no like glowing tesseract that landed to us from an alien planet that makes it all possible. It's built entirely from technology that's already here as a means to say, not that, hey, I figured it all out, pack our bags, we're going to move to Planet City, but rather if we can get a city working at this most extraordinary scale and density, there's nothing stopping us consolidating or reimagining the cities that we all occupy, like New York or London or Los Angeles.
Now, I can imagine that when you design a project like Planet City, you have the temptation to get to a scale that is the intimate scale of domesticity. So somehow you need to stop at some point, otherwise you can go on forever. Planet City can be a lifetime project, as can be any of your other projects. So how do you limit yourself, and how do you decide when and where to stop?
Reimagining the world is a large endeavor. But really what we're trying to do is mobilize imaginary worlds in the service of one big idea in the most part. Planet City is really built from the idea that technology, or that, let's say, climate change is no longer a technological problem. It's now a cultural and political problem, in that the technologies required to dig us out of the hole that we've created for ourselves are actually already here. They've been here for 10 or 15 years, but it's our own cultural bias, it's our own political hang-ups and complications that mean that we're not rolling these technologies out at scales that become meaningful. And that's really what Planet City is trying to do. So we design the world and the narratives of Planet City in such a way that hopefully deliver that singular idea, to get people thinking about that notion that the technologies we need in response to the climate crisis exist in plain sight, and we're not waiting for some tech billionaire to figure it out for us, but we can make these changes. We're not going to, but if we could, we could make these changes tomorrow. And that's an extraordinary, hopeful, and powerful place to be, on the cutting edge of the potential for change.
And this leads me to your most recent project, which is about this. It's about showing that we can make it happen already. Like it's The Great Endeavor, right? Which is a movie that you perfected or realized or finished in 2023. But before we dive into it, I wanted to give it an introduction, because in your website, you categorize your work into fiction, world building, documentary, and writing. And yet many works appear in all categories, others overlap. It's a reality that is mixed with fiction, and it's a very powerful concoction. The Great Endeavor really is that. It is a beautiful movie that envisions the next steps from the conclusions of recent studies, as you told me. So to reach survival goals, humans must convert the existing infrastructure towards the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so that it can be liquefied for storage beneath the ocean floor or mineralized into desert rock. And these are things that are happening, for instance, in Iceland or in Oman.
Say that works like Planet City and The Great Endeavor are what I would call new planetary imaginaries, which is to say that I think we're in desperate need of visions of a future that are planetary and collective in scale, visions of a future that offer a glimpse of hope and how we might need to operate, but aren't based in a lot of the failed ideals of boomer environmentalism that so many images of our utopian future currently are formed through. So I was interested in exploring technologies of geoengineering. Something like carbon removal and carbon sequestration is backed by real science and the desperate need to do something about the carbon levels in the atmosphere, but at the same time, they're extraordinarily controversial technologies because we're worried about engineering in those ebbs and flows of the atmosphere and ecosystems. But at the same time, the entire narrative around climate remediation is built on the fact that we need to do large-scale active carbon removal. And when we often talk about in the media limiting future carbon emissions and the numbers we're trying to hit through that process, what we don't realize is that those numbers that we've agreed upon are actually based on massive active carbon removal from just these technologies. But we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it because it's hard. We don't talk about it because our images of the hopeful and optimistic futures we want to get behind don't look like giant fields of carbon extraction fans powered by the world's largest solar field or the world's largest wind farm. But if we don't want to go extinct, our images of the future have to look like this in many ways. So the great endeavor is an illustration project, a science illustration project that visualizes the sheer scale and audacity of this planetary network of carbon removal infrastructure that we need to build in our lifetimes. And if we really do the numbers, that infrastructure will become the largest construction project in human history. It represents what will need to be a global collaboration at levels never before attempted. It's an endeavor that dwarfs in scale the digging of the Panama Canal or the landing on the moon or the Large Hadron Collider, yet it's quietly being built on the margins in the background. So we made this work to try and connect people to this necessary project and to talk about the idea that in our generation, we need to build a carbon removal infrastructure equivalent in scale to the current oil and gas industry. And we don't even talk about it, but it represents our generation's moon landing. So this project is trying to visualize what that could be as a means to get people talking about the inevitability of starting on this process.
And indeed, it is epic. I mean, you call it science illustration, but I have seen it personally at Tribeca Interactive here in New York in 5-channel projection over a gigantic room that surrounded you with these amazing works that cross oceans and deserts, and it was a mixture of the documentary shots that you took around the world and then computer graphic animation. But it leads me to, you talked about collaboration. You collaborate a lot. I mean, you're a filmmaker, which is collaborative by definition, and the same for a designer. And I know, for instance, that there are institutions that are involved in these projects, like National Gallery Victoria, my beloved colleagues there that always help commission some of the best work around. And also you collaborate a lot with, for instance, costume designer Anne Crabtree, she of The Handmaid's Tale and Westworld, or musicians like Emel or Lyra Pramuk. So how do you collaborate with them? What kind of brief do you give them?
Yeah, well, world building is not a singular endeavor created by some lone genius in a room somewhere. It's.
Are you sure? Are you sure? You're just being modest.
No, it's the mobilization of a huge collection of people. I mean, Planet City works with what I call the City Council, which is a group of scientists and technologists pulled from all over the world, leaders in their field, as well as Anne and her extraordinary costumes, and economists and political theorists, and so on, to try and explore all aspects, from culture through technology, infrastructure, architecture, society, and all the way through to really explore the nuances and the consequences of all these decisions that we have in front of us. So that's kind of the way we work. I begin by putting these collaborations together. As I said, the work of the great endeavor is really a work of science illustration. It's taking the data, the proposals that often are lost inside dense peer-reviewed journals or very disciplinary specific conference papers, and finds visual form for them as a means to connect them to audiences. the work is really a work of what I call data dramatization, as opposed to data visualization. That's just like looking at patterns in data and trying to represent them. Data dramatization is trying to take something like the complex data sets of parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere or rising temperature change, and instead find the drama that exists in them and find forms through which to connect people to those ideas so that they become visceral and meaningful. So science collaboration is at the core of what we do, but at the same time collaborating with people like Anne Crabtree, who's normally dressing the heroes of various science fiction or dystopian narratives in Hollywood as a means to find form that these stories of data and science can connect meaningfully and powerfully to audiences. We want to see ourselves in these narratives and to see ourselves dressed in these costumes, dancing and performing in the landscapes of Planet City is a big part of doing that.
Yeah, it's a whole procession, right? It's a procession through the city. That's the movie.
Yeah, the film of Planet City is essentially the planetary scaled festival that would be set in motion as we bring all of the world's cultures together. And we wanted to explore the cultural consequences of this act of densification. A lot of science fiction imagines that in some future of sufficiently advanced technology, when we're operating with this global mindset, we and all our cultural differences become assimilated. We all wear the kind of the unitards with our numbers printed on our chest. But in many ways, ritual, mythology, and cultural practice is what helps us cope with the unknown. And the costumes that we animated for that project are trying to imagine a world where that coming together actually heightens difference, and we celebrate these new rituals and new cultural practices that might go along with these new forms of city making, density, and being in the world. But we also collaborate a lot with musicians because, again, music is this amazing popular medium, and it's able to sweep you up in emotion and draw you into these stories, whether it be Forest Swords and Amel in Planet City or Lyra Pramik in The Great Endeavor. We create original scores that are trying to create a soundtrack for the future. Particularly in The Great Endeavor, Lyra was developing what I was describing as a planetary workers' song, a new score that would be sung by the workers of the world that would come together through this great endeavor to build this planetary scale carbon infrastructure. Because workers' songs originally was sung as a system of control to keep the body in rhythm and time as they move through the field. But across time started to become sung in solidarity as a form of community. And I was interested in this planetary community that would come together to act at these extraordinary scales that are necessary in response to the scale of crisis that we've created for ourselves. And music is a big part of doing that and connecting the audience to these ideas.
These are all your own projects. I wanted to talk, because I'm a fangirl, about a project that you were doing for Hollywood, because you were working for Showtime and Sony on the serial adaptation of Gattaca from 1997. How did you approach the architecture and the world building of that movie, of that series?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in many ways, some of my day jobs when I'm not designing the narratives of our own films and projects is working as a world builder and a designer here in Hollywood on projects and IP like the extraordinary attempt to turn Gattaca into a series based on the wonderful feature film that you're describing. And I exist in that context oftentimes, in parallel to a production designer, or in the case of Gattaca, I was in the writer's room trying to explore what the world 300 years in the future might start to look like. A world racked by division where some of those inhabitants of that world are entirely engineered, but others, the faith-borns, refuse to change themselves in that way. And what that divided city might look like was really the subject of my role inside that writer's room. tragically, it's one of the casualties of the strikes that have really decimated Hollywood in the last couple of years. Maybe it comes back, maybe it doesn't. You never know in this context. But I really am interested in that role where someone like me, exploring the ideas that we've been talking about, can intervene in that process and can find ways to encode in a show like Gattaca that would have been seen across all the streaming platforms and by audiences in the millions, can also deal with some of these ideas and to talk about bioethics and the responsibilities we have when engineering ourselves and the ecosystem around us, to talk about the cultural divisions and class divisions that might exist, and to put on screen representations of that, exaggerations of that aren't trying to predict or animate what might come, but rather offer a distance view from which we can look back in on ourselves in this present moment and start to understand how we might operate and think differently. This is a kind of sidebar, but in many ways, the reason that I operate in these territories of science fiction is not because I think these narratives are mediums of prediction. In many ways, prediction is just a side effect of science fiction. Sometimes it happens to get it right, but really, science fiction is a way to look back in on the present and help us and arm us with information through which we can use to make the most appropriate decision about where we want to move next. I'm really interested in this idea that 1984 is not about 1984 at all. It's about 1948, the year in which Orwell was writing, and his identification of certain trends that he saw emerging. And the fact that we live in an Orwellian reality of mass surveillance is not because he got it right, but in many ways because we didn't listen. So I'm interested in the ways that our relationship to the future, it can be shaped through these narratives that exist in popular culture.
Yes, that's what Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby used to say, that speculative design, which in this case could be science fiction, is a way to think of the possible consequences tomorrow of our choices of today. So it is extremely important also definitely in building our future. Well, we don't know what Hollywood is going to do, but in the meantime, I want to thank you for letting me live in your worlds, because it is always an endless and epic endeavor indeed. And I want to thank you for being here today. So you have all been listening to Design Emergency, to the podcast that Alice Rosthorn and I founded. And you have just heard from Liam Young, who's a filmmaker, researcher, artist, and explorer of futures that helps us also explore the future that we want to build. You can find images of his work in our Instagram feed at design.emergency, and then you can explore our archives to find more interviews by myself and by Alice with designers, with architects, and other creatures who are actively working to design a better world for all humans, all species, and all planets. Thank you for listening.